You know, when most Americans hear the words net neutrality or internet regulation, a certain fear takes over about losing access to unfiltered and inexpensive information on the web. And if you're a business owner and depend on your internet presence for profit, how will efforts to regulate the web affect your bottom line? These are just a few of the concerns Americans have as the United States government attempts to somehow effectively regulate the World Wide Web. Ajit Pai was appointed to the Federal Communications Commission in 2013 by President Obama. He's one of 2 Republican commissioners at the FCC, and he came out swinging this week and is blasting the net neutrality plan put forth by the president and FCC chairman Tom Wheeler, saying it's worse than I had imagined. He joins me from Washington, D.C. Thank you, Commissioner, for joining us. Just so we understand, does the president have to appoint Republicans as well as Democrats to the FCC?
Larry, first, it's great to be with you.
Thank you.
Under the law, the president does have to appoint no more than, or at least 2 members of the minority party, as well as 3 of his own party.
So in opposing your president, you're not going against the fact that he appointed you?
That's correct.
Okay. What? Break it down for me, because I've been in the business 58 years and new things pop up all the time. So what is net neutrality?
Net neutrality involves the basic question of what role, if any, the government should have in regulating how the internet works. And historically, over the last 2 decades, here in Washington, we've had a strong bipartisan consensus that started in the Clinton administration that the internet would thrive free of government regulation. And unfortunately, in a couple of weeks, it looks like the FCC is going to be poised to jettison that bipartisan agreement.
And what changed that thinking?
Well, what most immediately changed it was the president's announcement shortly after the November elections that he wanted the FCC to take a much more interventionist approach into the internet, adopt a very heavy-handed set of regulations that's known in the business as Title II. And although the FCC had been heading on a different course, after the president's announcement, the FCC chairman decided to follow the president's lead, and a couple of weeks ago put out this 332-page plan, which we're going to be voting on in a couple of weeks, and which the American people are not being allowed to see.
Now, the FCC votes on it, and then Congress has to vote on it, right?
Actually, once the FCC votes on February 26th, that is it. The people who are affected by this order can choose to litigate. They can challenge it in the courts. Congress can pass legislation to override it. But for the short term, what the FCC says is going to be the law unless somebody challenges it.
So you'll have to follow it until it's challenged or overthrown,
Correct.
right? Okay, the FCC doesn't control cable, doesn't it? Does it?
Actually, that's a good point. The agency exerts wide jurisdiction in this document over every facet of the communications industry, whether it's a cable company, a telephone company, or a wireless company, or even a satellite company supplying internet service. For the first time, the agency would assume sweeping power to regulate how all of that works.
But many consumer activists, they side with Google, Facebook, Netflix, and Amazon, all of whom support net neutrality. How do you explain that?
Well, I'm an avid consumer of all those services. And what I can tell you, both as a consumer and as a commissioner, is that I want a free and open internet. Most people do. And over the past couple of decades, the internet has been exactly that. In fact, what is striking about this 332-page document is that nowhere does the FCC identify any harms that have occurred. There's no actual problem that's identified here that needs to be solved. There's a lot of talk about hypotheticals. And in my view, if the internet has been a bipartisan success story for the past 2 decades, we should preserve that and build on that and give people more broadband options, not try to solve a regulatory problem that simply doesn't exist.
I'll play a little devil's advocate, Commissioner, if you'll allow me. I grew up with the fairness doctrine in broadcasting. If I put on a candidate for mayor in the city I was in, Miami, I would have to put on other candidates for mayor at the same amount of time. I thought that was eminently fair. I thought that when I did presidential candidates, I had to give one the same as the other. The public was much better served by the fairness doctrine, rather than not allowing one broadcaster, liberal or conservative, to just do his own way of thinking and put his own guests on. What was wrong with that?
Well, I think once the FCC got rid of the fairness doctrine, what you saw was an explosion in consumer choices. Once the government stepped out of the role of mediating some of the broadcasting decisions that were made, a variety of different viewpoints sprung up and across a bunch of different platforms. And there's no doubt it's a lot more rough and tumble in a lot of ways, but at the end of the day, people can find content where they like it.
But I hate to interrupt, but the minority candidate, even with this wide open spaces, he or she doesn't get the shot that the candidates of major parties gets. You know that.
Well, I guess, yeah, the analogy I would use, though, to the net neutrality debate is simply that once the government gets involved in deciding how the internet is going to function, then you essentially put the government into a position where it's going to be making decisions that the private sector, thus far at least, has been making better. And so, for example, if a consumer wants a certain wireless data plan that serves his or her needs, the government could say, well, that's too bad. We don't want you to have it. If there's a broadband plan that gives consumers better options at better prices, the government might say, well, no, we don't think that's fair enough. And so I think, especially in the digital age, it's a really dangerous place for a regulator to be when you're trying to decide who's going to win and who's going to lose in this rapidly changing marketplace.
More with FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai after this. Regulation is necessary. We should allow businesses to just go as they want. Just anything goes out there in the open. Let it happen. Don't you think government has a role in regulating some businesses?
Well, absolutely. There's no reason that we have to choose between the heavy-handed regulation that is in this document and no regulation at all. I think what we need to have is something along the lines of what former FCC Chairman Michael Powell proposed, the 4 internet freedoms. That people need to be able to access the lawful content of their choice. They need to be able to access applications of their choice. They need to be able to understand what their plan is actually offering them in terms of prices and that kind of thing. But it's a far leap from that kind of light touch regulation that the Clinton administration endorsed in the mid-90s to the heavy-handed regulation, which would put the government in the position of deciding how the entire internet operates. And I think we have to find that happy medium, and the last 2 decades have proven that the light touch model, in my view at least, has been a successful one for the American consumer.
So you're happy with things just as they are?
Oh, not at all. In fact, one of the things I have been very strongly pushing for since I got to the FCC was for us to adopt policies that make sure that more and more Americans, especially in rural America, have more broadband options. You know, when I cross the country and I talk to people and startup entrepreneurs in Kalamazoo, Michigan, or college students in College Station, Texas, what they say, what they mean when they say net neutrality is that they want more options. And so I view my role as a commissioner to make sure that we have as much entry into this marketplace as possible. Let all the entrepreneurs compete with the big guys. And if we do that, I think ultimately the problem of net neutrality will resolve itself without our intervention.
Do you think it'll pass when you vote?
I would expect that it's going to be a 3-2 vote on February 26th, barring some unforeseen circumstance.
Why is that regulation book so thick?
Well, that's part of the reason why I want this to be released to the American public. I think if you told the average American that the FCC is going to propose regulations for the internet economy that are 332 pages long, and you're not going to be able to see it until the FCC adopts it, they would think that's the wrong way to go. And part of the reason why I've been so outspoken about this plan is that it's very intrusive. Unfortunately, under the FCC's rules, I can't describe with any particularity what's in the document. And so I think that we at the FCC should be as open and transparent as the internet itself and let the American people see for themselves what it is that we're talking about.
Wait a minute, you can't tell me what's in the document?
That is correct. Stamped on the front is an internal, use-only, non-public moniker. And unless I'm authorized by the chairman to disclose this, I can't let you or any of the other millions of Americans who are interested in the internet economy know what the FCC is going to do.
Why?
Until we vote on February 26th, this document will not be released.
Why?
Well, that's been the traditional practice, believe it or not, of the FCC. The chairman circulates a proposal 3 weeks before we vote on it. It's kept secret within the walls of the FCC, and only after we vote on it and staff has a chance to make changes does the public get to see what exactly it is that we voted on.
So
and
technically,
especially on
What can viewers, if viewers are going to call the FCC, what are you going to tell them if they don't know what's in the document? Can I tell them don't pass this if I don't know what's in it?
That's exactly the problem, and that's part of the reason why I have been banging the drum in favor of releasing the document, and barring that, trying to educate the public as best I can within the rules to let them know what's in it. And they can certainly go to my website on the FCC.gov page and see some of the statements I've put out there that describe, with as much particularity as I can, what the FCC is poised to do. It's critical for the American people to be informed.
Have you read the whole thing?
I spent the bulk of the last 5 days reading through it, all 2,000 some footnotes, and I can tell you it is a pretty rough slog, especially when you've got a couple of toddlers climbing all over you.
Are there parts you agree with?
You know, I think in general, the overall focus on wanting to have a free and open internet is something that I embrace. As I said, you know, I rely on broadband internet access every day, whether I'm at home or on the go. But the question of the heavy-handed common carrier regulations that this plan would adopt, that's a bridge too far for me, because I think it's going to lead to increased prices for consumers, fewer options, and ultimately make the American broadband marketplace less competitive than it otherwise would be.
Moving off it for a moment, several news media outlets are reporting that Samsung has confirmed and warned its customers that its smart TVs are listening to our every word. Can the FCC do something about that?
Well, this is I haven't heard the particulars of this case, but what I can tell you is that there's been a growing interest in what is called the Internet of Things, of devices that communicate with other devices, that monitor you. And this is something that, as a consumer at least, I'm following pretty closely. The FCC does have narrow jurisdiction over privacy-related issues, and if it's something that somebody brings to our attention formally, then I'll be happy to take a look at it.
We'll have more on the president's net neutrality plan with FCC Commissioner Ajit Pai when we come back from the break. Don't go away. We're back with Commissioner Ajit Pai, commissioner with the FCC, appointed by President Obama as one of the 2 Republican members of that commission. And he has warned Americans about the president's net neutrality plan, which we're talking about today. Do you expect in the long run this to ever be approved with the Republican Congress stacked the way it is?
Well, I think the first challenge that people are going to confront is that the lawsuits will be coming fast and furious after we adopt this on February 26th. That could embroil the FCC in litigation for a number of years. Additionally, on Capitol Hill, as he suggested, a number of senators and representatives have been trying to come up with a legislative solution to solve once and for all this problem. You know, this is actually the 3rd time we are going to be attempting to regulate the internet, believe it or not, the FCC. The first 2 times the courts struck our attempts down, and I think at this point, if it gets struck down a 3rd time, there's no question that we need to go to our elected representatives and say, look, you need to figure out what you want our decision-making to be in this area, instead of trying to make up the law as we go along.
All advances have good and then some bad. What about the internet don't you like?
Well, I think by and large it's been tremendously positive. I can tell you that as a consumer, I rely on it for everything from the weather to getting directions to someplace I've never been before. Video is especially useful to me. There are going to be some downsides, and of course, as the first FCC commissioner on Twitter, I get a fair amount of vitriol that I probably wouldn't get if I was simply sitting in an office in Washington reading papers and meeting with people in person. But what I can tell you is, nonetheless, it's been a tremendous benefit to me in my official capacity, at least, and in my personal capacity.
Do we have a 2-tier system for the internet?
I don't think we do. I think that right now there are a variety of different speeds and prices for broadband, but the essential service is the same. A connection to the internet is a connection to the internet. Now, there might be some questions as to whether your connection is too slow or degraded, but by and large, that's a question that can be answered with more competition. And so one of the great things about this job is that I get a chance to meet with some of the smaller entrepreneurs, the wireless internet service providers, smaller cable providers, people supplying services over the top, as it were. And they are really bullish about the future if they are allowed to innovate without government intervention. And that's one way to solve this problem of haves and have-nots in the digital age.
In the digital age, do you fear a loss of privacy?
You know, I do think that there is something to the notion that as we become more and more connected with other people and with things, we start to give up more of our own personal information. And I've certainly noticed that having come of age in the 70s and 80s when you didn't have these connections to the outside world. But that's a balance that's continually going to have to be struck by the FCC and by society generally to try to figure out where to draw that line. We're happy to reveal this much information, but we certainly want to keep something private. And things have certainly changed, especially among the younger generation. They share much more than I'd be willing to share, that's for sure.
How do you like the job?
It has been the privilege of a lifetime. I never expected to be in this position, but having arrived here, it's been a joy meeting with entrepreneurs from around the country, with citizens who are interested in what we do, and being able to shape the future of technology policy, which is so fundamental, I think, to the role of America's competitiveness, it's just been a fantastic pleasure. And so long as I have the privilege of serving here, I'm going to do my best to give it my all.
How long is the term?
My term concludes in June of 2016, but under the law, if I or a successor is not confirmed by that point, I could stay until December of 2017. So I have about a year and a half or 2 years more.
It was great talking with you. I hope we can break bread when I come to Washington next month.
That would be terrific. Let me know, and we'll make it happen.
We will make it happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry.